Well, I'm very honored. I was really happy to hear the news, and in particular for the type of research I do, which is a little bit more outside the box, not the traditional economics. It's wonderful to see it recognized. Yeah, maybe I can pick two or three examples. One of my earliest work in behavioral finance dealt with overconfidence among top managers. So what I was showing is that some managers tend to overestimate how much value they can create in their companies, and as a result, make some distorted decisions. So for example, they might be too sure that they can create value not only in the existing company, but also in the next best one, which they will acquire. And there's an inclination to acquire too many companies which maybe don't fit so well with the existing company. And I think the bigger insight there was that these behavioral biases we have been thinking about for a while do not only apply to people like you and me, the common person on the street, but actually even to very successful, very smart people. So I think it helped start some change in thinking about behavioral economics as being part of, being human and not just some stupid mistakes some people do. Another aspect I've been investigating is related to a paper called Paying Not to Go to the Gym. There I was looking at people who sign up for gym memberships, in particular the monthly memberships where you can go as often as you want and pay a little bit more for that, and then they don't go very often. And I think it's a common phenomenon that we join these type of self-improvement type activities or investment activities in the broadest sense with lots of motivation and conviction that we will use them and do them, and then we tend to fall behind. That's something companies know, and they will fine-tune and design their contracts to make profits over it. So the insight here is that, if we just had this behavioral bias, we would observe people not going as often to the gym as maybe they want to, and that's interesting already. But firms recognizing that we have the bias, they make profit of us. Instead of paying for each marginal visit, which you could easily do with swipe cards these days, they have these monthly memberships. Well, and the last piece I would emphasize in terms of my research agenda is this work I've been doing on experience effects, on how our personal lifetime experiences stay with us and shape us in our risk attitude and behavior. So we economists often have a tendency just to use variables that describe who we are right now, our income, education, family status, maybe also forward-looking variables to predict what we're going to do, what job we'll choose, how we invest, etc. And what I'm saying is, no, we also need to look in the past. If I grew up in poverty, if I experienced some big crisis, that will stay with me and influence my behavior. Again, regardless of whether I'm smart about it and have all the available information at my fingertips. It's not about informational constraints, as economists often say, but it's really about our brain being rewired by our personal experiences. Yeah, that's exactly what my research is about, living through these crises, these adverse economic outcomes. How does it affect you? And being the typical economist, I would say it depends. And let me explain. What we found is that your personal experiences have the potential to have a big impact on your behavior going forward, but it depends on how big the experience was. Was it a big spike in inflation, and did it last for a long time? Then our brain really gets rewired and we start thinking differently about price stability and worry more for prices years and even decades later. If we get a handle on the crisis fairly fast, then there's less concern about it. So, with inflation, I think there has been some better news in recent months. And if we continue on that path, I'm actually pretty relaxed about it. If there is a generation I tend to particularly worry about, it's the relatively young consumers and investors, because for them, this experience of the recent crisis makes up a big part of their life so far. So that's always the perspective I have. Basically, take your whole lifespan so far, tell me how big the fraction was you were in this crisis, and that tells me, roughly speaking, how much weight people put on it. And so hence I would recommend to work particularly with younger people to make sure that they don't overreact to these spikes we have seen. As a person who's also involved in policy making, I, in some sense, don't want them to shape it too much because, for example, here in Sweden, you know, the stock market has been doing great for some years. And as a result, people who are shaped in their pension saving behaviors by pretty much any stock, you know, I'm exaggerating, but doing great might be tempted to think they can trade and stock pick and so on. And so the first thing I would say is it would be great if people have a default product that's broadly diversified, a default system they follow, because pension, you know, that's out far away, and we should have a long-term perspective which doesn't react too much to what was the latest economic crisis or boom. I mean, in this case, in my example, it's actually the boom I'm concerned about. More from a bigger picture perspective, we can say that saving for retirement is something humans are naturally tempted to put too little weight on. It's far away. We think about what's happening now. So here, having personally lived through tough times and seen what that might do to you, or like how tough it can be if you don't have enough money, is actually helpful in inducing people to do more precautionary savings. Yeah, that's another good question I care a lot about. So how do we get people to, you know, make better investment decisions using the insights of behavioral economics? The big insight emerging from my research on experience effects is that we should stop overestimating the effect of outright theoretical teaching. Like, so people like me tend to think if I explain to everybody what broadly diversified means and how to think about long-term investment, and that there is an equity premium puzzle with an equity premium, then everybody will understand they should invest in broadly diversified low-fee funds. Problem solved after I explained it. Well, that's not the reality. The reality is that we need to gain some personal experience with this type of financial investment in this hypothesis. So my research says if you want to get people to invest in these broadly diversified funds, for example, you need to expose them early on to what that means. So maybe, you know, give already kids in school like some starting capital of 1,000 kronas, and then it's another 1,000 later. You give them a default fund they invest in, some worldwide index, and then they follow it and see literally how it feels, you know, to be an owner of that, to see the update coming in and how it's been doing. They will see, okay, it's not like speculation that I can do some humongous profits with it, but also the downside is maybe less than I used to think. And that's a fairly safe tool I should probably be using without putting too much thought into it. So this kind of personal experience, I think, is very important. Sweden is already a country which is very equity market invested, so it doesn't need as much what I've been saying right now, but other countries like my home country, Germany, would definitely benefit from that. Vice versa, suppose, I mean, fingers crossed it doesn't happen, but suppose we have the next stock market crash coming at some point. I worry about people then overly shying away from the market and saying, oh, this is evil, I'm not going to touch this anymore. Here too, same approach. Instead of trying to explain that was an outlier, it's going to happen with very low probability. My research says there are limits to what these theoretical explanations can do, even for very smart people who certainly understand the math. You need to allow them to feel that it can be different. And again, having some policy that helps, that guides people towards investing in a broadly diversified fund and seeing, well, even including that crash we just lived through in my hypothetical scenario, even including that crash, this is still a good way to save for the long run, is what comes out of my research as the policy implication.